What is the first thing you do after logging into PeopleSoft? Click the navbar? Then what? Click on the navigator icon? Doesn't that second click seem wasteful? I mean, if the navigator is the most common target, why not default it to open? Actually, this is a very common customization. In this episode, I want to show you how to use event mapping to apply this change. Now let's start by investigating the navbar. As I hover over the icon, the lower left corner shows the target content, the URL. The PeopleSoft will load into the sidebar when I click. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that address. So copy link address, and then let's paste that somewhere so we can look at it. And we can see that it's based off of a component. That's fantastic because it means we may be able to enhance it through event mapping. Now, event mapping applies to component-based content references, not components directly, not content references, but component-based content references. So let's see if there's a content reference for this component. So in a new window, let's navigate to Enterprise Components, and then all the way at the bottom, find Object Navigation. And we'll put in our component name. And that's fantastic. There's already a content reference for us. Now, sometimes we find framework components like this one, and they don't have content references. Without a content reference, we cannot apply event mapping. But here's the good news. You can always create your own content reference. Okay, perfect. So let's set that aside. We'll need it when we apply event mapping later. But right now, let's write the code to automatically open the navigator when we click on the navbar. So let's inspect the navigator and the navbar. And let's just look at the HTML. So scrolling up, I can see that the content for the navbar actually loads into an iframe, meaning it's a separate web page loaded into the existing page. It's loaded into that sidebar. It has its own JavaScript, its own styling, and its own content. Now let's keep that in mind as it's going to be important later. Okay, now let's find the navigator icon because this is the one we want to trigger. We want to activate when we click or when we click on the navbar, we want to activate the click of the navigator icon. So I'm going to right click inspect, and sure enough, we can find the image there. Looking up, okay, a little bit farther. Okay, awesome. We see a click handler here, and we can see that they're actually in grid rows. Interesting. Each one of the icons in the sidebar represents a different row in a grid. Interesting. And even better, we can see that PeopleSoft applied a unique ID to this one specifically. So let's grab that ID, and then in the console, let's try out a little bit of JavaScript. How about document.getElementById? And let's just see what PeopleSoft finds or the browser finds. Okay, perfect. The browser found the element. Now let's see what happens when we invoke the click handler. That's perfect. Now it works fantastic here, but we're running this JavaScript after the browser loads all the content. And we need PeopleSoft to do the same thing. Run this JavaScript after the browser loads all the content. Now, PeopleSoft includes two fluid JavaScript functions, add JavaScript and add onload script. Now, add JavaScript will inject the JavaScript into the head of the navbar document. So looking at the content, that would be this section right here. But I want you to notice that JavaScript, this fragment, which says do this right now, that content would happen before there's actually content. That JavaScript would execute before there's content in the body. That's too soon. It won't work. So PeopleSoft provides the add onload script that's supposed to wait until all content is loaded and then execute. And I found it works great for most standard components, but it didn't work here. So we're going to take another approach. We'll use the add JavaScript function to inject our JavaScript at the top, but tell the browser to defer execution until the content is loaded. In other words, we'll use JavaScript to subscribe to the DOMContentLoaded event. So let's put our JavaScript into an HTML definition in Application Designer, and then write a couple more lines of JavaScript. So in Application Designer, new HTML definition. So here is our line of code that works flawlessly from the browser after the content's loaded, but we discovered that we need some way to wait until after the content is loaded. So what we're going to do is wrap this in an event handler, and we're going to register for or listen for the the DOM content ready event. Now, the code that I'm pasting in here, this is boilerplate code. You can find it on the internet in many places. Just your typical add event listener for JavaScript. And then let's see, that's perfect. Then we just need to close. So we've got our closing curly brace, and then we have our closing function or method invocation. Okay, that's great. So document.getElementById. Okay, so what we're asking our browser to do here is find this element and then invoke the click handler. Okay, now I have a question for you. What if the browser doesn't find this item? Then what will end up on the left of the dot is null, won't we? Undefined. And on the right, we'll be trying to invoke the click handler of undefined. That won't work, will it? Could that ever happen? Actually, yes, because the navigator is just a tile, and a user's access to that tile depends on security, depends on personalizations, depends on configuration. So, yes, it is. It's very possible that the navigator will not be there. So, let's do one more thing. Let's wrap this in a quick little test to see if the navbar was found. If it's found, invoke the click handler. If it is not there, act like PeopleSoft does by default. So let's just create a variable to hold the element itself. And then let's just test to see if it was found. And let's give it a name. How about, let's name it after the component itself. We'll use our site-specific prefix, JSM, JS. Now, what I'm thinking is we may have more navbar JavaScript that we want to put in here. I mean, let me give you another example. So as I click on the navbar icon, you notice that the navigator slides out. It's an animation. So over time, every certain number of milliseconds, the sidebar is revealing the content. So it's an animation. That animation happens over time, duration. So and that duration is hard coded in JavaScript provided by PeopleSoft. Now, I love this animation, but like many people, I've decided that animation takes too long. So we can speed it up by changing the hard coded number in the JavaScript. So maybe perhaps that's one thing I might do here is provide a new value for that animation. Something else I might add here. Okay, great, fantastic. We have JavaScript that we think is going to work. We'll test that out in a minute. Uh, Next thing we need to do is apply event mapping. Now, all event mapping solutions require a PeopleCode application class, a service definition, and a configuration. Let's start with the application class, and we recommend naming it after the component so it's easy to find. So let's create a new application package. We'll give it our site-specific prefix, JSM. We'll give it the same name as the component so it's easy to find. And then we'll end with the suffix EVT. Now, I also recommend a structure that matches the shape of your components and the events that you're using within those components. So I'm going to use a subpackage that's named after the object triggering the event. Now, the question is, what's the name of that object? So we know the name of the component, and the event I want to use is page activate. So it's going to be a page. So let's open the component and find the pages, PTNB navbar. Okay, fantastic. That's the name of the page. Let's, just to make sure that we don't have any typos, we'll copy that. And then we'll insert our subpackage. And then the event that I want is page activate. So I'll name my class page activate. And then we just need some code. Now the PeopleCode is incredibly simple, especially considering our free PeopleCode templates available through our GitHub repository. So in GitHub, we have the PeopleCode templates repository and then our event mapping template. I'll just copy this PeopleCode. And then right here, all we need is add JavaScript and the name of our HTML definition. Now let's go ahead and finish the event mapping configuration. So online, we'll create a service definition, people tools, portal, and related content service, define related content service, add a new value. Let's use our site-specific prefix again, JSM. And I'm thinking this could be for JavaScript for everything related to the navbar. So how about that? Let's call it the PTNB navbar JS service ID and service name navbar.js. A URL type will be application class, and the name of our application class is, what was it again? Let's find it in App Designer. And the path is our page name, and then what event we'll save. Oh, don't you love that save notification styling? We show how to do that in one of our other sound bites. So the next step is to map the service definition into the target component. And that's where the component we visited earlier, the find object navigation, becomes very valuable because that showed us where the content reference exists, which was under fluid structure and content, fluid people tools framework components, and then the path to the navbar. So let's do that. Let's go to manage related content service, event mapping, and then map application classes to component events. This one's actually a hidden content reference. So fluid structure and content, fluid people tools framework, and then there it is, the navbar, the content reference for the navbar. And let's go to page level event mapping, and let's find the page. So the page that we want to map to is called PTNB navbar. So the page, PTNB navbar, perfect. And our service ID was called JSM. JSM PTNB navbar JS, perfect. Processing sequence post, so it triggers after all Oracle delivered code. Save. Okay, let's test it out. Let's see if it works. Let's reload. And now when I click on the navbar, it should automatically expand the navigator. Oh, that's fantastic. That's beautiful. Now, before we end, we should answer one simple question. Should we implement a solution like this? Now, the point of fluid navigation is to eliminate navigation. Fluid favors search and business process-based tiles. In fact, some organizations have completely eliminated the navbar. So with that in mind, the navigator is supposed to be the navigation of last resort. But for me, I'm much more effective with the navigator. So for me, yes, I would implement a solution like this, but I wouldn't implement it publicly. Instead, I would test for role membership using is user in role before applying this change. In my people code, right here, I would wrap this in is user in role to determine, is this a user that has the navigator? Is this a user that's expected to use the navigator? So that let's just open it for them. A user like me, a user like a back office user, an administrator, a PeopleSoft developer. Now, the navbar is supposed to be an ever-present set of tiles that can open content in a separate sidebar. Let me give an example. Here, my team. I love this. This is beautiful. You see, you and I as developers, you and I as administrators, you and I as business analysts, I think that when we look at the navbar, we get this narrow focus and we think navigator. The navbar exists as an intermediate step to launch the navigator, and that's it. But the navbar is so much more powerful. There's so much more here. It's an ever-present list of tiles that can open its content in a sidebar. So tell me, do you have more ideas for improving the PeopleSoft user interface? If so, share details in the comments below. We love to hear about your projects. Now at JSM Pros, we teach people tools and web development concepts like this every week. Be sure to check out our website to see what we're offering next. Or here's an idea. Subscribe to our LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter feeds to receive updates every time we post a course. Or do you have a team that wants to learn more? Give us a call and let's get something scheduled. Now, before we go, I have a question for you. Do you have a topic you'd like us to cover in a future soundbite? If so, let us know by sharing your idea at soundbites.jsmpros.com. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more content. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.